as someone that was in these protest spaces before the Sanders Corbyn moment, because I'm a true believer that the Sanders Corbyn moment is kind of where socialism, communism, these words become more comfortable to say. Identities start to get built around these ideologies.
Yeah.
But we're also coming out of the 80s and 90s, and if you were, I don't know, leftist wasn't even really a term people used. I don't even, alternative counterculture person. Liberal was still kind of a good word in some circles. You were anti-consumerism. And do you think what we saw in 2008 was kind of an extension of this anti-consumerism?
I think that's partly right. Yeah. I mean, I remember, I studied anti-consumerism back in the, but sort of in the 2006, 7, 8 period. I remember, kind of when I was at university writing a thesis on that. And that was of a piece with a certain like anti-modernist left, which tried to reject the superficial aspects of corporate life in the name of, well, it's unclear what it was in the name of. It was sort of based on an imagined idea that one could do without industry, do without a lot of the superficial aspects of consumerism. But it was really premised on an idea that everyone has enough. Everyone's kind of fine. Their lives are fine. So if we just consumed less, we would have a more authentic way of living. Right. So I think it's interesting because that's very of a piece with the pre-crisis moment when the economy is not politicized, when people's living standards are really not. It's like, well, there's economic growth. We don't really care about that. We're kind of against it, but probably don't even think about it because economic growth is something that happens on in the background. Capitalism works even according to its own terms. And so what we need is to try to carve out a more authentic way of living within this. So what if we just got rid of Walmart, where all those horrible poor people shop?
Yeah.
Yuck. Yeah. Ew, right? So there was a different snobbery to that anti-consumerism, but not that disguised, I think. But that all changes again. That all changes after the global financial crisis, Occupy and all that kind of stuff that comes after the occupations. That is a moment of well, it responds to the global financial crisis and the question of austerity, but it also tries to respond to the crisis of democracy and the lack of representation. But its answer to that question is anti-political. So broadly speaking, it rejects the political establishment without really proposing anything new in its place. There are no big banners that are waved that say, hey, we want socialism, or we want, at best it was calls for direct democracy. I think that was probably the extent of it. But broadly speaking, it was a rejection of those politicians there who don't represent us, who don't have our interests at heart. And if they were gotten rid of, maybe something good happens, right? Or maybe we just need to get rid of democratic politics as a whole and just have some more direct form of representation. At its furthest extreme, it's precisely that horizontalist notion that we all here encamped together are the new government, that we can kind of rule directly over this little space. And then you have the farcical reenactment. It was already kind of farcical, right? It was already farcical, but then you have a farcical reenactment of that during the Black Lives Matters protests, of 2020 or 2021, 2020. Where you have the occupation in Seattle and stuff like that. So, But that's like this bizarre continuity, and I think it's important to mention that. You might say, well, that's a quite specific example. Who cares? I think it's important because it shows that the way that so much of these waves of left activism keep kind of repeating themselves, even when they appear to be the opposite. So even when you've had, in the more direct scenario is like, well, you have the waves of occupation, then you have the more the kind of Corbyn Sanders moment where you're focused on elections and winning power, and it seems far more serious, and it's talking about socialism. And then when that all falls apart, it's like, well, let's back to the anarchism, back to the anarchism wagon. Let's go do the thing that we were doing before. But as I'm sure we'll come on to discuss in a second, what's fascinating is that this second wave of millennial left activism, the Corbyn Sanders moment, retains a lot of continuities with the first moment, even though in many ways it pretends to be its opposite, right? So even though the first wave is like leaderless, it tries to be horizontal. It says there's we're all here kind of collectively together. We just need to occupy this square, and then the regime will fall, right?
Mhm.
At least, that was what was going on in Egypt, but to a certain extent in Spain. The second wave then says, no, actually, we need leaders. We need to focus on elections. We need to talk about power. We can't just be in the square and make our demands and be the good guys against the bad guys, and then good things will happen. No, we need to be much more practical. We need to be much more engaged with power. But then but what's ironic is that they have these bizarre sorts of continuity between the leaderlessness and the leaderist focus, despite them seeming opposite to one another. And I mean, one of the objectives of the article, or I guess the main one that I want to bring out, is to kind of learn the lessons from this, because we don't want to find ourselves in 5 years' time with suddenly another upsurge of activism amongst the masses as a whole. And not just the educated middle class, because in most cases we're talking about kind of educated middle class, albeit downwardly mobile, being the main agents of these protests and of the political parties and the kind of Corbyn Sanders moment. But if there's another upsurge, so we don't just repeat what we did before, thinking like, well, now it'll be right this time.
But you and I know it's one of the further questions down the list, but you speak about the leaderism. I've definitely done some work on that. There's a video essay we have called, I think it's called "We Don't Need Another Hero," where I somewhat jokingly talk about the love affair with daytime talk show hosts and how it seems funny, but we have to remember that Donald Trump became president of the United States. Right. Jesse Ventura became a governor, and Arnold Schwarzenegger became a governor. So we do have a love affair in this country. Ronald Reagan was a president with celebrity culture and its ability to kind of wrangle the masses. And in the 80s and 90s, I'm sure you might not know, U.S. pop culture to this extent. And if you did, I'd be shocked if you remembered Morton Downey Jr.
Nope.
That's okay. Okay, good. Because if you knew that, I was going to walk up yourself and say, turn the TV off. But he was a pretty far right figure. But before we kind of have, I don't want to say an understanding, but images based on these ideologies, where people can actually say, I am brand right winger, I'm brand leftist. Morton Downey was just brand loudmouth, but he was to the right of people like Rand Paul in the 80s and had an extremely reactionary show, but it resonated with young people, and his audience would be filled with young people that wanted to see him pretty much yell at leftists, which I found kind of interesting. And there is something to be said about this moment where everybody wants a hero, and there does seem to be a feeling of doom and gloom as 2024 looms near, and there's this election coming up in the States, and no one knows who to vote for. Well, I don't want Biden, I don't want Trump. It's like, well, it's never been the only thing you could do. There was a world where we organized around other shit.
In fact, it's probably better that there is no one to get behind. Like you're that. That might focus minds on.
But it feels like the focus on institutions or organizations isn't even there. I mean, DSA is losing members. So what's happening with this idea of leftist organizations even?
So I think one of the most positive, and I don't want to, in no way do I want to oversell this, but I think one of the positive elements, it seemed, of the period, let's say the populist period, because let's just for the sake of terminology, there's the protest period, which runs up till around 2014 or something like that, and then you have the populist period, which is 2015 to 2020. And so the populist period is now turned towards organization, at least ostensibly. It's turned to elections, turns to leaders, it turns to kind of in some way trying to get people all together in a more formal structure. And it's it's not by any by chance that at least two of the books, and indeed in our book as well, talks about the question of organization. And it's not like it's very important, I think, not to reduce the question of organization to just a tactical question. So like, oh, well, how do we organize better? Like, what do we do? And I think across a lot of the left, there's often a very regular confusion of tactics and strategy, and indeed of those two, and goals, which are not the same thing at all. So when you talk about organization, I don't mean like, oh yeah, well, we needed to knock on doors in a different way, or change our messaging, or we needed to, get people form smaller groups or larger groups or whatever. That's not. Those are kind of very much tertiary kind of questions, or tactical ones. The question about organization is fundamentally an ideological one. It's about how you conceive of politics. And so you might have an insurrectionary conception of politics, where suddenly the masses who kind of break past their instinctive conservatism and turn out on the streets, and then that can lead, either they be led by a small group, vanguard group, or somehow just all collectively seek to overturn the powers that be, and storm the Winter Palace or whatever. But that implies certain organizational questions about what you should be doing, right? Whether are you going to form that vanguard group to lead the people once they all turn out on the street? I mean, that's a legitimate answer. I'm not sure it's the right one, but it's a legitimate answer, right? Which follows on from your conception of politics. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's slow building with that capillarity, which I think is a word that's not really used in English. It's maybe in Portuguese, so I get that confused. But basically from the grassroots up, that you have hierarchical and linked organizations, and that capacity which is built from kind of the local level of civic organizations through the political party all the way to the top, and that you build this political bloc, and little by little it gains ever greater power, getting, winning 5% at the election, and then 10%, and then 15%, and then trying to break through to get a majority, or at least a plurality in an election. And then that entails other organizational strategies and tactics, right? What I think is like the real problem with the whole period of the millennial left is that these questions are at best broached in a purely tactical manner, and that they skip steps, right? So the problems of organization, particularly the ones that Vincent Bevins talks about in his book on the kind of global protest movement, I think it's fairly obvious, because I think most people already agree with what the problems are there. The idea that you just occupy a square or the streets, and you shout slogans and good things ensue, when we know that can be very easily co-opted, and at worst ends up in civil war. But in a less bad scenario, it just ends up disappearing and evaporating with nothing having happened, or it's co-opted by the right in different ways and used to their benefit. So I think everybody knows that that's like bad, right? It's like we shouldn't do that again.
I don't ever underestimate. Don't ever.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, if you're listening to this and you think it's good, it's not. It's bad. Okay. It doesn't work. It's actually disastrous. And you have to speak for yourself and say what you're about. And the fact that all these occupations and protests rarely had a real name for themselves, and certainly didn't have a name for what they were for, I think tells you all that you need to know. If you don't speak for yourself, someone else is going to speak for you, and that's what ends up happening. You have the international media speaking for you, framing it as a kind of color revolution style pro-democracy uprising that suits kind of U.S. imperial interests, or you'll have more organized and more ready to use violence right-wing groups who are able to seize the moment, or just simply large corporations, the media, etc., who will be able to turn it towards their own interests. So that's very bad. But so let me just get to the point about protest. What you think the protest movement, or excuse me, when the populist movement resolves about that, is by having a more focus on organization. But as I point out in the essay, there's like some ironies here. So what happens is, like with these with some small nuclei who organize these, end up kind of inadvertently organizing or calling these mass protests, or these protests which grow to be very big, is that because they don't have any formal organizational structure, it ends up relying on informal friendships, right? So it ends up being you and your mates calling the shots, and there's no accountability there, much less accountability than a formal organization where people are elected to leadership positions, and you can recall them, hold them to account, and so on. And that applies at very small, like nuclear level, as well as in much larger organizations. And the irony is that the populist turn on the left from the 2015s onwards is that a lot of the political parties, and you can look at various examples in Europe, tend to replicate that, because instead of having a formally organized party with branches, with branch leaders, with cadres being formed, having a chain of responsibility leading up to the top, what you've got is this whole mass of new members who've often joined for nothing. Maybe they haven't even had to pay dues, or they've joined for very little, and therefore can leave without any real consequence, and often have joined via online platforms. So you get this big mass of people, and Arthur Borriello and Anton Jaeger's book is very good in explaining this dynamic. You have this mass of people, and then you have this leader at the top, and maybe you have a small number of other people who support the leader. But what happens is that this is ostensibly very democratic, because you have this big mass of people who can vote on what policies they want to be pursued or whatever. But there isn't really the space for deliberation to happen. And so it's not really the membership creating policy in the traditional way that political parties used to work, but rather a big mass of people often just ratifying what the leader has decided to do. And what ends up happening is that you end up with a fairly unaccountable clique of people at the top making shots, calling the shots about how the party should act, what its policy should be, what its general approach should be, what its politics should be. So the populist moment thinks it's avoiding and circumventing or resolving the problem of organization of the horizontal moment of the protests and the occupations. What it actually does is, in many ways, it replicates it, because it doesn't really grapple with the deep organizational problem, which is the lack of density of civil associations, which form the building block of parties, and always did. And so, that's one of the many ways in which the populist moment tries to skip steps politically, I think. And we can maybe talk about some of the other ways, but ultimately it's based on a kind of quick shot at power, right? Like, let's just grab what we have here, try to cobble something together and make a quick shot at gaining executive power. And we find that doesn't work. And even when it does work, it tends to fall apart pretty quickly.
Well, were you living